Pope Peter, Saint Peter, 1st century, originally named Simon, was a fisherman from Galilee before becoming one of Jesus' closest apostles. According to the Gospels, Jesus renamed him Peter, meaning rock, declaring him the foundation upon which the future church would be built. This moment became the cornerstone of Catholic tradition, later interpreted as establishing Peter as the first leader of the church, effectively the first pope. After Jesus' death, Peter emerged as a bold leader among the disciples. He preached openly in Jerusalem, worked miracles, and guided the early Christian community through persecution. As the faith spread, Peter traveled to Antioch and eventually to Rome, which at that time was both the imperial capital and a dangerous place for Christians. In Rome, Peter became a central figure of authority. Tradition holds that during Emperor Nero's brutal persecution in the mid-60s, Peter was arrested. Humble to the end, he insisted he was unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. He was crucified upside down around 64 to 67 AD. His martyrdom turned him into both a spiritual symbol and a rallying point for the believers who survived. Long-term, Peter's legacy cannot be overstated. His burial site on Vatican Hill became the location of St. Peter's Basilica, the center of Catholicism. The unbroken succession of popes claims authority through him, and his story embodies themes of weakness turned into strength, from fisherman who denied Christ 3 times to fearless martyr who gave his life for the faith. Peter set the template for papal authority, spiritual leadership, and faithful sacrifice that defined the papacy for centuries. Pope Leo I, Leo the Great, 440 to 461, born in Italy at the tail end of the Roman Empire's strength. By the time he became pope in 440, the empire was fracturing under pressure from both internal corruption and external invasions. Into this chaos stepped Leo, a man of clarity, courage, and extraordinary persuasion. His defining moment came in 452, when Attila the Hun, feared as the scourge of God, marched into Italy and threatened to destroy Rome. Instead of abandoning the city or relying solely on imperial armies, Leo personally rode out to meet Attila. What exactly passed between them is debated. Some accounts say Leo's presence, faith, and political finesse awed Attila. Others claim visions of saints frightened the invader into retreat. Either way, Attila turned his forces back, and Leo became legendary as the pope who saved Rome without a sword. But his influence went beyond diplomacy. Leo asserted that the pope was not just bishop of Rome, but the supreme authority of the entire Christian church. His letters and sermons defined core doctrine, including the belief in Christ as fully divine and fully human, a cornerstone of Christian theology formalized at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. When Leo died in 461, Rome's empire was crumbling, but the papacy was rising. Through his strength of will and clarity of vision, Leo the Great transformed the pope into more than a spiritual shepherd. He made the papacy a decisive political and doctrinal force. His legacy endures as the first pope truly seen as both a defender of the city and a teacher of the universal church. Pope Gregory I, Gregory the Great, 590 to 604. Born into a wealthy Roman family during one of history's darkest chapters, the Western Roman Empire had fallen. Italy was reeling from famine, plague, and attacks by the Lombards, and the city of Rome itself was a shadow of its former grandeur. Amid this chaos, Gregory reluctantly rose from the life of a monk to become pope in 590. What made him great was the way he combined spirituality with practical governance. Gregory reorganized the church's vast land holdings, using the income not merely for luxury but to fund relief for the poor, ransom captives, and provide food during famine. In doing so, he reshaped the papacy into not just a religious office, but a stabilizing political force in a fractured world. He also transformed worship. Gregory encouraged uniformity in liturgy and music across Christendom, setting foundations for what later became known as Gregorian chant. While the exact melodies were refined later, the association with his name reflects how deeply he influenced the rhythm of Christian prayer. Beyond administration and liturgy, Gregory left a mark through teaching. His writings, especially the pastoral rule, became a handbook for bishops and priests on how to lead with humility and responsibility. He also sent missionaries to convert the Anglo-Saxons in England, extending the church's reach far beyond Italy. When Gregory died in 604, Rome was still battered and broken, but the papacy stood taller than before. He gave the office a new identity, a leader who could protect, feed, inspire, and teach. His blend of monk-like humility and statesman's pragmatism set the benchmark for what a medieval pope should be. That is why history remembers him, quite simply, as Gregory the Great. Pope Urban II, 1088 to 1099. When he became pope in 1088, the church was powerful but divided. The eastern and western branches of Christianity had recently split after the Great Schism of 1054, and the Byzantine Empire was under siege from advancing Seljuk Turks. In 1095, Emperor Alexios of Byzantium appealed to Rome for help. Urban seized the moment not merely to defend Byzantium, but to unite Christendom under papal leadership. That November, Urban delivered his now famous speech at the Council of Clermont. Eyewitness accounts differ, but the message was revolutionary. He called on knights of Europe to put aside internal wars, take up the cross, and liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. He promised both spiritual rewards and forgiveness of sins for those who joined. The result was electrifying. Noblemen, peasants, and warriors across Europe rallied in massive numbers, shouting Deus vult, or God wills it. The First Crusade that followed was brutal yet unprecedentedly successful. By 1099, Crusaders had captured Jerusalem. Though Urban himself died shortly before news reached Rome, his call had reshaped the destiny of Europe and forged the blueprint for centuries of crusading. Long-term, Urban's decision had immense consequences. It temporarily restored ties between East and West, established the Pope as a leader who could mobilize kings and commoners alike, and unleashed a legacy of holy war that would dominate Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. Urban II is remembered less for his administrative reforms, and more as the Pope who turned words into an army and lit a fire that changed the medieval world forever. Pope Innocent III, 1198 to 1216. When he took office at just 37 years old, he was young by papal standards, but he wasted no time making himself the most commanding pope of the Middle Ages. His vision was absolute. The Pope stood not only as spiritual head of the Church, but as supreme authority over kings and emperors. Innocent made this clear through bold actions. He forced Philip II of France to take back his wife after an unlawful divorce. He pressured King John of England into accepting the Pope as overlord, while also compelling him to lift an excommunication that had placed England under interdict, effectively shutting down all church services in the realm. In disputes between monarchs, Innocent consistently emerged as the final arbiter, using excommunication as both a spiritual and political weapon. He also wielded influence on the battlefield. Innocent called for multiple crusades. The Fourth Crusade, meant for the Holy Land, infamously resulted in the sack of Constantinople in 1204, which deepened the divide between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity. He also launched the Albigensian Crusade in southern France against the Cathar heresy, a campaign as brutal as any fought in the Holy Land. On doctrine, Innocent convened the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, one of the most important in church history. It defined central teachings, including the doctrine of transubstantiation, standardized clerical expectations, and reinforced papal supremacy over all Christendom. By the time of his death in 1216, Innocent had transformed the papacy into an institution that rivaled and often surpassed the authority of kings. Ruthless in politics yet deeply influential in shaping doctrine, he embodied both the power and the peril of papal supremacy. His reign marked the golden moment when the papacy truly dominated medieval Europe. Pope Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303. He came to power in 1294 after the bizarre resignation of Pope Celestine V, a saintly hermit utterly unsuited to the politics of Rome. Boniface, by contrast, was a lawyer and fierce administrator with one goal: to reassert the papacy as supreme power over Christendom. His reign, however, was defined by clashes with kings who no longer accepted papal dominance. When he attempted to stop Philip IV of France from taxing the clergy, Philip struck back by limiting the export of money to Rome, starving the papal treasury. Boniface responded not with compromise but confrontation. In 1302, he issued his most famous decree, the bull Unam Sanctam, a searing statement that declared submission to the Pope to be necessary for salvation. It was the boldest and arguably most provocative claim of papal supremacy ever made. But instead of cementing authority, it sparked outrage. Philip sent troops to Italy, and in 1303 Boniface was captured at Anagni, humiliated by royal agents. Though freed soon after, he died shortly afterward, broken and disgraced. The outcomes were immense. Boniface had intended to prove papal dominance over secular rulers. Instead, his defeat marked the end of that dream. Within a few years, the papacy was relocated to Avignon under French influence, a period often remembered as the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Long-term, Boniface VIII represents the turning point when kings emerged stronger and popes weaker in temporal politics. His audacity is still remembered. He was the pope who proclaimed himself supreme over all earthly rulers, only to watch the papacy's political power crumble in the struggle with Philip the Fair. Pope Gregory VII, 1073 to 1085. Before becoming pope, Hildebrand of Savannah was a reforming monk determined to clean up church corruption. When elected as Gregory VII in 1073, he brought that firebrand zeal directly to the papacy. His central fight became the Investiture controversy, the great medieval struggle over who held the power to appoint bishops, the pope or secular rulers. For centuries, emperors and kings had treated church offices like political prizes, handing them to allies and relatives. Gregory declared this practice sinful, insisting that the Pope alone held authority to invest bishops. His claim went further. He asserted that the Pope could depose emperors themselves if necessary. It was an audacious reshaping of church-state relations. Enter Emperor Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. When Henry defied him by continuing to appoint bishops, Gregory excommunicated him in 1076. This act, cutting Henry off from the church, was spiritual and political dynamite. Rebellious German nobles turned against the emperor, forcing Henry to seek forgiveness. The confrontation climaxed in 1077 at Canossa, when Henry famously crossed the snowy Alps, stood barefoot in the cold for 3 days, and begged Gregory for absolution. Though Gregory granted it, the struggle was far from over. Henry eventually rallied, marched into Rome, and installed his own antipope, driving Gregory into exile, where the pope died in 1085. Even in apparent defeat, Gregory's impact was lasting. The investiture controversy continued for decades, but his boldness set a precedent that popes could, and did, claim spiritual authority above emperors. Gregory VII reshaped the medieval church, proving that papal power could challenge the mightiest rulers in Europe, and his defiance became a template for centuries of conflicts between throne and altar. Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, 1492–1503. Few popes are as infamous as Rodrigo Borgia, elected in 1492 amid widespread accusations of bribery and corruption. Already part of the powerful Spanish Borgia family, he treated the papacy less like a spiritual office and more like a dynasty to advance his children and secure his family's grip on power. As Pope Alexander VI, he became the archetype of nepotism. He openly acknowledged his children, highly unusual for a pope, and arranged military and political roles for them across Italy. His son Cesare Borgia, in particular, became both feared and admired as a ruthless statesman who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince. Alexander's pontificate was marked by constant scandal. He lived extravagantly, presided over decadent festivities in the Vatican, and made brazen deals with European powers to strengthen his position. His court became a symbol of Renaissance success. Yet beyond the reputation, he was undeniably influential. Alexander navigated Italy's turbulent power politics with cunning, manipulating alliances between France, Spain, and local Italian states. He oversaw the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the newly discovered world between Spain and Portugal, a decision that shaped global colonial history. When he died in 1503, rumors swirled of poisoning, though more likely he succumbed to malaria. His death left behind a deeply stained papal legacy, but also one impossible to ignore. Alexander VI is remembered as the bad pope par excellence, corrupt, worldly, and audacious, yet his reign demonstrated how deeply the papacy was entangled with the politics, culture, and ambitions of the Renaissance. Pope Julius II, 1503–1513, nicknamed the Warrior Pope, was as far from a cloistered monk as one could imagine. Elected in 1503, he inherited a papacy tarnished by corruption and weak leadership. Instead of retreating into religion, Julius picked up armor and set out to transform the papacy into both a military and cultural superpower. Unlike most popes, Julius personally led troops into battle. He marched at the head of armies to defend and expand the papal states, reclaiming lost territories and crushing rivals. To him, the pope was not only the shepherd of souls but also the sovereign of central Italy, and he was determined to prove it. But Julius was equally ambitious in art and architecture. He commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a project the artist initially resisted, yet which became one of the most iconic works in Western history. He also began the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica, a grand vision that would take more than a century to complete. Under Julius, Rome blossomed into the artistic capital of the Renaissance. His legacy is paradoxical. On one hand, he turned the papacy into a warlike principality, a pope in armor who fought like a prince. On the other, he left behind cultural treasures that shaped civilization itself. Julius II is remembered as a figure of raw power and indomitable will, a man who saw the pope as both commander and patron, whose battles echo not only in history books but also across the ceilings of the Sistine Chapel. Pope Leo X, 1513–1521, Giovanni de' Medici, son of Florence's most powerful banking dynasty, was raised in wealth and culture before becoming Pope Leo X in 1513. For him, the papacy was not a burden, it was a stage. He surrounded himself with art, lavish banquets, pageantry, and hunting parties. Famous for saying, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," Leo embodied the Renaissance prince-pope. But his extravagance came at a cost. The papal treasury quickly emptied under his festivals, building projects, and patronage of the arts. To fund it, Leo expanded the sale of indulgences, certificates promising reduced punishment for sins in exchange for money. While this was not new, Under Leo it became widespread, commercialized, and deeply resented. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther protested against indulgences in his 9-to-5 theses. Leo initially laughed it off as a minor academic spat, underestimating the tidal wave of reform it unleashed. When Luther refused to back down, Leo excommunicated him in 1521. But by then, the Reformation had caught fire, fracturing the unity of Western Christendom. Ironically, Leo was also a great patron of culture. He continued work on St. Peter's Basilica, supported Raphael and Michelangelo, and brought Renaissance Rome to dazzling heights. Yet his reign is remembered less for its beauty than for its folly. Leo X died suddenly in 1521 at the age of 46, leaving a papacy bankrupt, divided, and facing its greatest crisis in history. His legacy stands as a warning. A pope who enjoyed the brilliance of the Renaissance but underestimated the storm of reform, and in doing so, changed the Church forever. Pope Paul III, 1534 to 1549. When Alessandro Farnese became Pope Paul III in 1534, the Catholic Church was reeling. Martin Luther's Reformation had split Europe, Protestant churches were spreading, and the papacy's moral authority was badly tarnished after a century of corruption and decadence. Paul III recognized that survival demanded reform, and he became the architect of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. His boldest move was convening the Council of Trent in 1545, the most significant Catholic council since the Middle Ages. Spanning nearly 2 decades, beginning under his leadership, Trent defined church doctrine with crystal clarity, reaffirming the sacraments, papal authority, and traditional teachings while rejecting Protestant challenges. It also directly addressed corruption, placing stricter standards on bishops, clergy, and the education of priests. But Paul's reforms were not only doctrinal. He officially approved the Society of Jesus in 1540, the Jesuit order founded by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits became the intellectual, missionary, and teaching vanguard of the Counter-Reformation, spreading Catholicism globally and defending it within Europe with relentless zeal. Politically, Paul had to balance his reformist zeal with Renaissance family loyalty. He used nepotism early in his papacy to consolidate power, but his latest seriousness about reform won him respect as a leader who rose above his family's interests. By the time Paul III died in 1549, the papacy had begun to shed its reputation for corruption and had repositioned itself as a disciplined, global force. He didn't stop the Protestant movement, but he gave Catholicism the structure and energy to survive it, and to endure as a worldwide faith. Pope Clement VII, 1523 to 1534. Elected in 1523, Giulio de' Medici became Pope Clement VII at one of the most turbulent moments of the Renaissance. Europe was split by the Reformation, France and the Holy Roman Empire were locked in rivalry, and the papacy had already lost much of its prestige to corruption and political weakness. Clement's reign would prove both dramatic and disastrous. The first great crisis came in 1527, when troops of Emperor Charles V sacked Rome. Thousands were slaughtered, churches desecrated, and the Pope himself narrowly survived, imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo before negotiating his release. The sack of Rome marked the end of the Renaissance papacy's splendor and underscored Clement's lack of political control in European affairs. But Clement's most famous challenge came from England. King Henry VIII, desperate for male heir, petitioned Clement to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Torn between theological principles, pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew Charles V, and Henry's demands, Clement stalled and ultimately refused. That decision had earth-shattering consequences. In 1534, enraged at papal resistance, Henry rejected Rome's authority and declared himself head of the Church of England. What began as one man's annulment request turned into a permanent break, splintering Western Christianity further and creating a national church independent of the papacy. Clement VII died later that same year, remembered as cautious and indecisive. His reign saw the sack of Rome, the strengthening of Protestant Reformation forces, and the birth of Anglicanism. Though not the most corrupt or flamboyant pope, Clement is remembered as a leader whose hesitation in the face of crisis opened the door to one of the most dramatic religious shifts in Western history. Pope Pius IX, 1846 to 1878. Giovanni Maria Mastiferetti became Pope Pius IX in 1846, and he would reign for over 31 years, the longest in church history. At first, he was celebrated as a liberal reformer. Pius granted political amnesties, supported modernization, and even earned praise from revolutionaries who dreamed of reshaping Italy. But the revolutions of 1848 changed everything. When Roman nationalists forced Pius to flee the city, he returned a year later under French protection, shaken and far more cautious. From then on, he shifted sharply conservative, determined to defend church authority against both liberalism and nationalism. His papacy also coincided with the unification of Italy. As the Italian kingdom expanded, the papal state shrank, until in 1870 Rome itself was seized. The once powerful Pope King was left a prisoner in the Vatican. The temporal power of the papacy dissolved after more than a millennium. Ironically, the loss of territory gave the papacy a new, spiritual focus that endured into modern times. Yet Pius IX also reinforced papal authority in another way: doctrine. At the First Vatican Council in 1870, he formally proclaimed papal infallibility, the idea that when speaking ex cathedra on faith and morals, the Pope cannot err. It was one of the most controversial but lasting statements of papal supremacy. When Pius died in 1878, the papacy had been stripped of lands but strengthened in spiritual authority. His reign symbolized the end of the medieval papacy and the beginning of its modern role, no longer a territorial ruler, but the moral and doctrinal heart of Catholicism worldwide. Pope John XXIII, 1958–1963. When Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli was elected in 1958 as Pope John XXIII, many saw him as a short-term caretaker pope. Elderly, jovial, and humble, he was expected to keep the seat warm while maintaining tradition. Instead, this unassuming figure stunned the world by launching one of the most transformative events in church history, the Second Vatican Council. Known affectionately as Good Pope John for his warmth and kindness, he believed the church needed to open its windows and engage with the modern world. In 1959, he announced Vatican II, which convened from 1962 to 1965. Though John did not live to see it completed, the council he initiated reshaped Catholic life. It introduced Mass in local languages instead of only Latin, encouraged dialogue with other Christian denominations and religions, re-emphasized the role of the laity, and sought to balance tradition with contemporary needs. John's personality was as influential as his policies. He radiated approachability, visiting prisons, embracing children, and projecting humility after decades where popes often felt distant and remote. His humanity helped him become beloved across denominational and even secular lines. When he died in 1963 after only 5 years as pope, the grief was global. Yet his legacy was profound. Vatican II modernized Catholicism, bringing it into dialogue with a rapidly changing world, and John XXIII became a symbol of openness, pastoral care, and courage to change. In the end, the caretaker pope became a reformer whose short reign reshaped the church for the entire modern era. Pope John Paul II, 1978 to 2005. Karol Wojtyla of Poland was elected pope in 1978, becoming John Paul II, the first non-Italian pope in over 450 years and one of the most dynamic leaders the church had ever seen. Charismatic, athletic, and deeply spiritual, he quickly broke from tradition by traveling extensively, turning the papacy into a truly global presence. Over his 27-year reign, he visited more than 120 countries, bringing Catholicism to millions face-to-face. Yet John Paul II's significance went beyond pastoral visits. As a Polish pope during the Cold War, he embodied defiance to communist oppression. His 1979 pilgrimage to Poland electrified the nation, inspiring movements like Solidarity that helped erode Soviet control. For many, he became a spiritual catalyst in the eventual collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. In 1981, he survived an assassination attempt in St. Peter's Square when a Turkish gunman shot him at close range. John Paul not only survived, but later visited his attacker in prison to offer forgiveness, a public act of mercy that cemented his image as a pope of compassion. Doctrinally, he upheld traditional Catholic teachings while writing extensively on human dignity, sexuality, and social justice. He also helped improve interfaith dialogue, becoming the first pope to visit a synagogue and a mosque and reaching out to Jewish and Muslim leaders alike. When he died in 2005, billions mourned. His funeral gathered one of the largest crowds in modern history, and he was canonized as a saint less than a decade later. John Paul II's blend of global charisma, resilience in suffering, and symbolic role in reshaping the 20th century make him one of the most legendary popes, an enduring figure whose shadow still looms over the modern church.